kind of short, so I'm going to move this. All right. Good afternoon. Introduce you to here with us today is Carol Lippert, Associate Superintendent of the High Academic Standards for Students Division, Jonathan Moore, Amy Waller, Studies and Civics Education Program Specialist. We are all happy that you could join us today. We will review the current that you may have related to the draft of the standards. That being said, down the hall across from the elevators. After the recess, we will take questions and comments on the meeting. Engaged participant. Be an active listener, which includes being open to new ideas and speaking one at a time respectfully. So first we're going to start with a little overview of the process. So this is the process, a final draft to go to the state board. So in order to understand the draft, we want to make sure that everybody understands the difference between. So standards can also include both content and skills because those are still what we would like our students to know. Next is curriculum and instruction. So curriculum is the resources used for teaching and learning the standards. Curricula are adopted at the local level by districts and schools. Instruction is the methods used by teachers to teach their students. Instructional techniques are employed by individual teachers in response to the needs of their students in their classes to help them progress through the curriculum in order to master those standards. So curriculum and instruction is the how. Lastly, I just want to go over real quick the statutory references for the academic standards. And I'm not going to bore you with all the mumbo jumbo in there, but just generally, there are quite a few statutes that reference the standards. So we have ARS 15-701, which directs LEAs, or local education agencies, to incorporate the academic standards that are adopted by the State Board of Education and taught in common schools. These are prescribed for both K-8 and for high school, as you'll see in 15-701.01 and 15-703, and 15-749.09 refers to the implementation of those academic standards by, again, the local education agencies. In addition to that, you have back to the how. And so the how was the curriculum and the instruction. And so we have Arizona Statute 15-721, which directs school districts and charter school governing boards to approve the course of study for schools with grades K through 8 in your core areas. And then you also have the Arizona Statute 15-722, which directs school districts and charter school governing boards to approve course of study for high schools. So that is just a very quick overview of what standards are, what curriculum and instruction are, and how that is portrayed through the Arizona statutes. I would now like to turn the floor over to Mrs. Tammy Waller, Director of K-12 Social Studies and World and Native Languages, to review the draft of the new History and Social Science draft standards.
Good afternoon. The first thing I want to talk to you about is the implementation timeline. We began this process when the State Board of Education, I have to put on the glasses now, when the State Board of Education opened the process to revise the standards. Prior to that, the standards had not been revised since 2005. From October through December of 2016, ADE collected public feedback, and that public feedback is still available for individuals to view on the old standards. We took that public feedback and we used that public feedback as we created our current draft. From January of 2017 through November of 2017, we called in working groups from across the state. These working groups were made up of educators, district curriculum specialists, instructional coaches, higher education, and also some of the organizations involved in history and social science in the state, like the Arizona Geographic Alliance and the Arizona Council for Economic Education. And we brought these working groups together to write the draft that was released on the 26th. Then there was a period from December 2017 to the spring of 2018 where we had internal review, the draft of the standards, presentation to the State Board of Education, and we'll be reconvening our working groups of educators, content experts to do the revisions on the standards based on the public feedback that we receive. We have an anticipated fall of 2018. We hope to go to the State Board of Education for the adoption of the standards. And then we move into a transition and implementation year where we will work with educators throughout the state, and we will have professional development, create resource documents, and there'll be a transition year from 2018 to 2019, and full implementation of the new standards will hopefully happen 2019 to 2020. A little bit about the working groups. The working groups were comprised of 86 educators from around the state. We had 11 counties represented. 4 counties did not file any applications to work on the committee, even though we had reached out to those counties. Other than that, we had representation from every county in our meetings. In addition, we had 54 districts, 11 charter schools, and several institutes of higher education who were involved in the process. We were also lucky enough to have educators at each meeting from the communities, our native communities here in the state. All working group agendas and presentations are located on the History and Social Science Standards Review update page. Oh, I knew I would do that. Update page, I'll remember, I promise. And you can see as each of the working groups has a meeting, we post the agenda and the PowerPoint from the previous meeting. So this is a little visual of our implementation and support. We'll be providing ongoing professional development to educators on the new standards, guidance documents and resources for educators, parents, and community members. We'll continuously collect new feedback. Once the standards go into implementation, we still accept public feedback for that process to determine areas of need. We collaborate with professional organizations and institutes of higher education, and we'll communicate with educators, parents, and the community. So before we begin, and I'm going to take you on a little tour of the new standards, I want you to think about, when you think about learning history, what does it mean to learn history? How many people, when you thought about learning history, thought about people, places, events, dates? I know I did. Okay. Facts. So when we think about learning history, we think about facts. And one of the facts that I remember from my second grade teacher is in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. It's a fact. In 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed across the ocean in an attempt to find a route to trade with India and smacked right into the Americas. But what does it mean? Why is it important? As a student, why should I care about this one fact? What the new standards attempt to do is they take facts in geography and history, economics and civics, and they build on those facts looking at a larger picture. So thinking about Columbus sailing the ocean blue, what are some other things that are happening? That fact doesn't tell us what was happening in Europe that led to exploration and discovery. It doesn't tell us how the voyages of Columbus and other explorers impacted the lives of Europeans. It doesn't tell us how their voyages impacted the lives of the native peoples who were already living in the Americas. It doesn't tell us what technological advances the voyage spurred. It doesn't tell us what the impacts of his voyage were on the creation of the United States or on the individual student themselves. It certainly doesn't tell us why we have pizza, why pizza has tomato sauce on it, which is linked to Columbus. And it doesn't tell us why Columbus Day is a national holiday but a source of conflict among different communities today. So facts are essential. The new standards build on the facts to look at the larger whole. A lot of times in my job, members of the community come to me and they say, our kids are not learning history. They don't know anything about civics. Schools aren't teaching map skills. And that's simply not true. What's happening is they're learning history, but they're not remembering it because they're not doing anything with what they're learning. So why is it important to look at the larger picture? It's important because we want students to be thinking like a geographer, a historian, economist, a financial advisor, a political scientist. We want them to do the same work that a historian would do or a geographer would do when they're in their classrooms. And why we want to do that is because the goal of education is to create active, informed citizens. And to have students grow up into active, informed citizens, it's going to require some skills. They're going to need to think analytically, read widely and critically, write cogently and in a compelling manner. And that's what the new standards do. They develop from kindergarten all the way through graduation the skills. So when a student graduates from school, whether it be a public school, a charter school, they will have these different skills so they can participate fully in our system. So how are the standards set up? The standards are organized around 21 big ideas. And those big ideas are on pages 6 and 12 of the new standards. We thought they were so important we put them in twice. And what the big ideas, the committee came up with the big ideas by starting with a question. They were broken up into grade bands, and a grade band would be like kindergarten through second grade, third through fifth grade, sixth through eighth grade, and high school. And we posed a question to these members of the working group. What do you think kids need to know when they leave the classroom at the end of second grade, at the end of fifth grade, at the end of eighth grade, at the end of high school? So these educators worked for several meetings, and they came up with what they felt like students should be able to do and know to be active, engaged citizens at the end of these grade bands. And then we looked at these lists that the educators came up with, and they were able to categorize them, and the categorization of those became the big ideas. So there are 21 big ideas, and they focus on content and processes and skills. There are 4 that deal with processes and skills, 4 that deal with civics, 5 that deal with economics, and that includes 1 that is specific to financial literacy, 4 that deal with geography, and 4 that deal with history. And these are not the standards. The standards are organized underneath the big idea. They can be applied to local, state, national, and international events, history, geography, political systems, economic systems. So the standards for each grade level are written under the idea, the umbrella of the big idea. All 21 ideas, big ideas, appear within each grade band. So when a student goes from kindergarten to second grade, they're going to hit all 21 big ideas. Third through fifth grade, sixth through eighth grade, and high school has all 21 big ideas. The standards also have what's called a storyline. From kindergarten through eighth grade, at the beginning of the standards, is a story about what the students will be learning at that grade level. It covers the time period, the region, the events, the big events that they'll be looking at. In addition, there are key concepts and ideas provided for support and guidance under some of the standards and big ideas. An example of this would be if a parent, and this was some of the public feedback that we got back from parents, I don't understand what my kid is supposed to learn. I look at the state standards, the 2005 standards, and they're all over the place. What is my kid learning about? So we took that and we created these storylines for kindergarten through eighth grade. And a student who's in third grade, the parents can look at the storyline and say, okay, my student in third grade is going to be focused on Arizona studies. They're going to be looking at history, geography, they'll be looking at the political system, and they'll also be looking at economics as it applies to Arizona. My students in sixth grade are going to be focusing on world regions and cultures, looking at the Eastern Hemisphere, which is everything except the Americas, and they'll be looking at that up until 1500. So it gives parents and educators and students themselves a nice encapsulation of what their year is going to cover. High school is a little bit different because in high school, all 21 big ideas and all the standards are proposed at the high school. It's up to the individual school districts or charter schools to organize those standards into the courses that meet the state requirement. So I want to take you through a big idea, and I want to show you how a standard would fit under that big idea. So starting with disciplinary skills and processes. If you look, there's a Wordle, an image towards the bottom left. And what a Wordle is I went through the big ideas under disciplinary skills and processes and the standards, and I pulled out the key words that appeared. And I put them into a Wordle, which means that a word that appears more is bigger than a word that appears fewer times. So you can look at the Wordle and you can see in disciplinary skills and practices, students are going to be looking at historical sources, primary sources, secondary sources. They'll be looking at causes and effects. They'll be looking at events. So the big idea number one under disciplinary skills and practices is chronological reasoning requires understanding processes of change and continuity over time, which means assessing similarities and differences between historical periods between past and present. That's a big idea. It's not a standard. But what does a standard look like as you take your child through first grade all the way through high school? In first grade, students are going to place important life events in chronological order on a timeline. In fourth grade, this standard gets more complex because students are going to create and use a chronological sequence of related events to compare developments that happened at the same time. Fourth grade storyline is focused on the Americas, the history of the Americas, American studies from prehistoric times up until the eve of the revolution. So students will be looking at events. They might be looking at the 13 colonies and how those different colonies developed. They might be looking at the convergence of the Spanish, the British, and the French, and the impact of that convergence on Native people, on trade. In seventh grade, they're going to analyze the connections among events and developments in a broader historical context. Seventh grade is contemporary global studies, and it's the United States and the world together. So students may be looking at what was happening in Asia, in Europe, and in Asia and Europe and the United States during the eve of World War II. Students would be looking at those different historical events and context. And in high school, they're going to take it even deeper, and they're going to evaluate how historical events and developments were shaped by the unique circumstances of time and place, as well as broader historical contexts. How did the Enlightenment period influence the American Revolution and the creation of the Constitution? So looking at that development of time and place. Continuing on our tour, we'll look at civics. Civics' big idea is understanding of civic and political institutions as a society and principles these institutions are intended to reflect, including knowledge about law, politics, and government, are essential to effective citizenship. What does it look like as your child goes through their K-12 career? In first grade, students are going to explain the importance of rules and laws in their community. In third grade, They're going to describe the origins, functions, and structures of the Arizona Constitution, local governments, and tribal governments, because third grade is focused on Arizona studies. In eighth grade, they'll compare the structures and powers and limits of the government at different levels in the United States. And in high school, they get even more complex because they're examining how the United States Constitution established a system of government that has powers, responsibilities, and limits, and then they analyze how those powers, responsibilities, and limits have changed over time. For economics, and you can see the big words in there, spending, because financial literacy is a very important part. The big idea is a financially literate individual understands how to manage income, spending, and investment. So in first grade, students will describe reasons to save and spend money. In third grade, they'll identify positive and negative incentives, a new idea, incentives that influence financial decisions people make to save and spend money. In eighth grade, they're going to look at the relationship between interest rates, savings, and return. And in high school, they're going to compare the cost and benefits of different types of investments as they become financially literate individuals. Geography. Geography, big idea. The use of geographic representations and tools help individuals understand their world. Second graders will use and construct maps, graphs, and other geographic representations of familiar and unfamiliar places in the world to locate physical and human features. Fourth graders will use and construct maps and graphs to represent changes in the Americas over time. A seventh grader will use and construct maps and other geographical representations to explain spatial patterns of cultural and environmental characteristics. And a high school student will use geographic data, not just maps and representations, but data to explain and analyze relationships between location of place and region. And one of the big public feedback notes we had is, where do students learn their capitals and states? If you look at fifth grade geography, by the end, one of the standards is by the end of fifth grade, students will know their capitals and states. And then finally, history. And one thing you'll notice about history is there is no separate standards for world history and American history. The standards can be applied to content in world history, in Arizona history, in U.S. history, in local community history. The big idea is cycles of conflict and cooperation have shaped relations among people, places, and environments. A first grader is going to explain the benefits of cooperation and compromise as ways to solve conflict in our community. A fourth grader will describe the cycles of conflict and compromise that occurred in the Americas during the convergence of Europeans, American Indians, and Africans in the Americas after 1492 from the perspectives of all three groups. An eighth grader will explain how different beliefs about the government's role in social and economic life have affected political debates and policies in the United States. And a high school student will evaluate the short and long-term impacts of conflicts and their resolutions. And by choosing the word conflicts, a student can look at the debates between the Anti-Federalists and the Federalists and what ended up happening in terms of the creation of the Constitution and the enduring conflicts over that creation that happened today. They can look at conflicts in American history like the Civil War, conflicts over westward expansion. In world history, they can look at conflicts over imperialism, World War I, World War II, conflicts with the Cold War, and current conflicts that are happening in the world today. So the standard applies to different events, and the events are found in the storylines and the course considerations in the document itself. In addition, oops, I'm going backwards. Sorry. It's odd not to see what you're doing. In addition to these standards and the big ideas, we have inquiry elements. The inquiry elements support and reinforce the ELA standards. When the Common Core was ended here in Arizona, one of the things that ended also was the disciplinary literacy standards. We used to have standards where students would read and write about social studies content as part of that. When those went away, the expectation to read, write, speak, and listen about social studies didn't go away. The inquiry elements teach students to read, write, speak, and listen about geography, economics, civics, and history by developing questions, gathering and evaluating sources, developing their claims, and communicating their conclusions in written, visual, or oral form. So what does it look like K2? In kindergarten through second grade, students will be developing their foundational reading and writing skills. And the social science standards and history standards will support the development of those literacy skills by providing content and background knowledge, which is essential to literacy. In civics, history, geography, and economics, while introducing students to specific skills like chronological thinking, civic principles, the use of maps and globes, and interpreting primary sources. Kindergarten theme is children as citizens. First grade is communities living and working together. And second grade is the world around me. Third through fifth grade. Thank you. Students, third through fifth grade, are continuing to build their literacy skills, but they're increasing their content knowledge and skills in history, civics, economics, and geography. Standards at this grade band will focus on state, regional, and national history and geography, setting the stage for an introduction to global and world studies in the middle grades. 6th through 8th grade, this is probably the area that we receive the most public feedback from teachers, especially 7th and 8th grade, that it was very disjointed. 6th grade, students will be looking at world regions and cultures up until the 1500s in the Eastern Hemisphere. 7th grade is contemporary global studies, 1500s to the present. That does not exclude United States history. United States history is done in that course looking at big turning points in world and U.S. history, like World War I. It's hard to talk about World War I from only the U.S. perspective. It's hard to talk about World War II from only the U.S. perspective, the Cold War. So we're taking the idea of the United States in the world, because this is the point in history where the United States becomes a dominant world power. So the standards reflect that through the integration of world. A student in 6th through 8th grade begins to look at the world and the role of the United States within the world. 6th grade students explore the beginnings of history and civilization through the Enlightenment. The influences of Greece and Rome, along with European impacts on our society and development, are introduced. As students enter 7th grade, United States history is taught through global turning points, including imperialism, World War I, World War II, the Cold War, comparative governments, and economic systems. By 8th grade, a student has spent 7 years learning about the world around them, starting with their classroom all the way through the world. 8th grade is where students will begin to see their place in continuing the story. 8th grade's focus is citizenship and civic engagement, but that does not exclude history and geography and economics as part of the story. Students will go back to the foundations of the political system, examine how ideas and founding documents are enduring today through many different topics, looking at things like civil rights movements, social movements. They'll be looking at economics and history and the impact of the United States government in other places. High school. I keep going backwards. High school. High school is a little different. Legislation dictates course requirements for graduation. The legislation tells us students must have 1 year of Arizona American history, 1 credit of world history and geography, and half credit each of government and civics. The standards are put into these courses by the school districts and the charters to meet the statutory obligation. And this is a minimum. Many schools have 4 years, so the standards give them flexibility in how they'd like to put those standards together. The standards will repeat in various courses. For example, world and American history will use several of the same standards. Geography standards will be found in several of the courses' civic standards. Geography is integrated into all 4 courses, or if you're lucky enough to be in a school district that has a 4th year of social studies, then perhaps a standalone geography class is offered and the standards could be a standalone. So reading the standards. One of the things I've noticed with public feedback is that people are skipping right to the standards because they're really excited, but they're not reading the course considerations for high school, which outline the scope and sequence of what a civics course would have in it, what a world history course would have in it, what an American history course would have in it, what an economics course would have in it, or they're not reading the K-8 storylines. So you have to read two things to look at the standards. You have to look at the storyline or the course consideration if you're looking at high school, and then you apply the standards to the story in order to see how the standards fit in to the context. So what does it look like? I'm going to give you an example. Sixth grade. Sixth grade is looking at world regions and cultures up to the 1500s. So a sixth grade example would be the Black Death. How did the Black Death affect people of the 14th century? Might be a question that students could explore. There'd be an inquiry element where they'd gather information from primary and secondary sources. There would be standards with disciplinary skills and processes. They'd analyze connections among events and developments in various geographic and cultural contexts, and they'd organize applicable evidence into a coherent argument about the past. The big idea would be global interconnections and spatial patterns are a necessary part of geographic reasoning. And the standard would be to describe how natural and human-made catastrophic events and economic activities affect people living in nearby and distant places. So the Black Death is an excellent fact, an event that you can use to meet the standard. So what might it look like to a teacher? A teacher could have a task, using featured sources, create an annotated illustration depicting how the Black Death affected different groups of people in the 14th century. Featured sources could include primary sources like the bubonic plague statistics or an illustration of the persecution of Jews during the Black Death, and a text, a secondary source, on social and economic effects of the plague. Teachers would unwrap this topic with students. They would have to talk about the Black Plague, what was happening in Europe, how the Black Plague was spread, probably talk about trade routes and the Silk Road and things like that. And then they would have students using those sources create the annotated illustration. And because I'm a teacher at heart, I had to give examples from the field. So this is one way that you could interpret the standards. So an overview of the changes. What changed from 2005 to the present? The largest change by far is we shifted from performance objectives. We didn't have actual standards. We had performance objectives. We had lists of people, places, and events from grade to grade that had no connection to them. So we shifted to broader standards to allow greater depth and connection. And this was based on our public feedback. We had a lot of public feedback in opposition to the amount of performance objectives, the lack of connection between them, and the lack of logic as to how they were put together. We organized the standards around 21 big ideas to allow for coherence, depth, and rigor. We connected social studies content with disciplinary skills, including inquiry elements. We added financial literacy at each grade level, and we created coherent storylines from kindergarten to 8th grade, which built upon each other and were developmentally appropriate for the grade level that was represented. And this is the pyramid of learning, and it kind of talks about what people retain. And passive teaching methods, retention is lower than active teaching methods. And this is not to say that we're dictating instructional methods, but one of the criticisms of the old standards was the sheer amount, let's go from Plato to NATO in 1 year, that's impossible to do with any type of depth, that these standards didn't allow for deep teaching. And we shifted to standards based around big ideas so teachers could take time and teach the standards well. And it also gives the LEAs flexibility, which was one of the things that they asked for, flexibility to be able to pick certain events, to have a little bit of flexibility with that. So during the break, you guys are probably ready for a break. We ask that you fill out the comment card and give it to ADE staff. Restrooms are located right out these doors in the vestibule directly across from the elevator, so go out and take a left and you'll see the restrooms. And there's snacks and beverages that can be purchased using credit or debit card right next door. So we're going to take a 10-minute break, And then when we return, we will open it up for questions, comments. Thank you very much. Is it okay? So it's time for Q&A and comments, and I have some papers that were handed in, and I don't know if the individuals want to go ahead and state their comments or want me to read them into the microphone.
Just call their name and ask them what they want to do. And what we would need you to do, though, since we are recording this for people who can watch it later or who weren't able to come, is if you want to read your comments in, we would need you to come up and read it into the microphone so that it would be recorded. So you can just call their name, and then if other people want to come up after you, go through those.
Okay, so Mr. Altman. Yeah.
Oh, there's one right here? Yeah. Oh, just sit down. Make yourself at home.
You can sit down. Oh, but of course you want your paper.
Okay. I may add to this.
You didn't memorize it?
Okay.
Good afternoon. Thank you. I'm John Altman. I'm a certified teacher in Pinnacle High School. I teach American government and politics. I teach world history and geography. Last year I was teaching in middle school in the Title I environment, so I have a flavor of the middle school and the high school. I think the middle school and the high school standards proposed are just a solid improvement. And teaching what I do at last year in the middle school level, I agree. I think we need to push down to the middle school certain requirements that they teach that, and then when they get to high school, we have something we can build on, that we don't repeat or buy the same real estate twice. And I know that my sophomores at the beginning of this year complained that they felt that the world history course is somewhat repetitive what they did during middle school. I think the kids are smart enough that they get that part. For the civics portion, the civic standards, as someone who's worked in and around government a long time, I'm retired 22 years Navy intelligence. I've been active in government work. So when I as teaching in government, the one thing I find that my seniors lack is a foundation in Arizona history. So when I get to the part about Arizona government, I have to teach them Arizona history to get them to appreciate some of the legislative and reasons why we do what we do in Arizona. So when I read the American history standards, wow, we're talking more Arizona history. That would certainly help to have that foundation there. I'm in a kind of unique position because in those 22 years of intelligent work, part of that was spent in leadership positions where I'm an end user of high school graduates that enlist in the military and then become an intelligence analyst. And the best ones that we have are ones that I didn't have to spend a lot of time with and reteaching part of history and government, because we need that skill set. And you don't immediately think about that, but those youngsters that come to us and that skill set was strong, it was easier and faster to make them good analysts of that. So I was an end user, and then my last position was as the senior enlisted advisor in the National Command Staff on overseeing the curriculum and development of what we did with 2,000 of those sailors to train them and keep them in training. So I'm a little bit used to curriculum development and that. So when I look at the standards, I looked at it from the standpoint of having been a user or customer, if you would, for that student we produce. I think these are great standards. I've had some friends of mine involved in the process. I think this makes a lot more sense than what I'm teaching now. Opens up the window to teach more on the back end of the 20th century events in world history, whereas right now I'm trying to run to that and manage that time, because I think I think our students relate to that. It's foundational to them as they proceed to a junior year, and then when I get them back as a senior. So I'm pretty happy. I think there probably is some tweaking in here that we could do, but I was warned by others. In particular the middle school effort, this thing was going to change, but I'm really happy with what I'm seeing. If I was still teaching in the middle school, I'd say this would be great. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Barbara, did you want to read yours?
I don't. I've got a copy here. Hi, my name is Barbara Gray. I'm the program director for the Thomas R. Brown Foundation in Tucson, so I'm up here from Tucson today. And I am also a teacher with about 20 years of classroom experience, now retired, but I taught throughout the social studies. My last 12 years, I taught economics and advanced placement economics, so my comments today will be directed toward the new standards concerning economics. In order to get this feedback, I sent out the new standards to my leadership cadre, which consists of elementary, middle, and high school teachers, and I got their feedback. I also got the feedback from Stephen Reff, who is a retired lecturer from the University of Arizona with about 40 years in the field in economic education. So we have a good bit of feedback coming to you today from Tucson. So first, I'd like to commend the committee for their hard work. These standards evidence a lot of very thoughtful and detailed and hard work. So I think that that you guys did a great job. My comments, as I said, are going to focus on economics. The elementary standards appear to be built on the assumption of 30 to 45 minutes a day, a gradient that moves up as kids go through the higher grades in elementary. Our feedback from teachers, we work with elementary teachers frequently throughout the year, indicate that, you know, with time considerations and constraints that they have, they tend to fit in about 30 to 40 minutes a week on social studies. So at the lower grades and the upper elementary grades, they're not putting in anywhere near the amount of time that the standards would dictate. My recommendation is that we help teachers to understand that economics is very interdisciplinary, and it can attach to math, it can attach to reading, children's books, etc., especially at the elementary levels. So I would hope that we would make that available and apparent to elementary teachers. Beginning in upper elementary and certainly by middle school, I'm going to recommend that any reference to costs and benefits should be just tweaked a little bit to be called marginal costs and benefits. Because we do want kids to begin thinking marginally. And when they get to middle school and high school, that will become very apparent. You know, in economics, we say all decisions are made at the margin. And in fact, changing the marginal cost or marginal benefit really changes the outcome of the decision. It's also a more algebraic way of thinking. And ultimately, when they get to high school, it's calculus. So I would recommend that we make that very minor tweak. The more basic concepts at the elementary and middle school levels, the more we can do of that, and I do see a lot of it in the new standards, the less the high school teacher has to do. No high school teacher should need to take 2 weeks to teach supply and demand. That should be well grounded in kids by the time they get to high school. And it really ends up becoming an encroachment on a very limited amount of time. A high school teacher has to cover basic economics, micro, macro, international, and personal finance all in one semester. So I'm pleased to see that there is a lot of attention devoted towards starting out the process for basic concepts in upper elementary and middle school. As well, supply and demand are ideally suited for pre-algebraic concepts, XY coordinates, coordinating pairs, etc. At the high school standards, the role of institutions should be more clearly defined. Are they referring to governmental or financial institutions? Those really are treated quite differently in economics, so I'd go in and make that distinction. Also, standard HSE 5.1 talks about understanding the advantages and disadvantages to trade. There are a few axiomatic principles in economics, but one of them is trade makes us better off. So I'd go back and have a think about that, or maybe a discussion about whether or not you want to have an advantages versus disadvantages when it's really so broadly accepted in economics that trade is a net gain to both sides. And otherwise there would be no trade. One of my teachers commented that the AASL standards, the big table in there, was just brilliant, and thank you for putting that in. That think analytically on page 3 is wonderful. Although the teacher recommended that the correct order for analysis should be gather information, analyze it, and then communicate the findings. Under the big ideas on page 6, I would I would submit that all economies are interdependent, not just market economies. And you identify market economies as being interdependent. In fact, even traditional and command economies operate interdependently. The high school standards should probably include a discussion on the role of slavery, because that was a very important economic resource that in the antebellum South in terms of productivity, and I think there's lots of ways you can go with that, but it should interface with U.S. history. And my group, my leadership cadre, and I all agree that the high school standards should have some mention of income inequality, which has been very well documented since the 1970s. Should probably remove traditional economies. In modern economics, we've kind of moved away from that idea of traditional economies. And that the high school standards should include a little bit on market externalities. And that can be at either the micro level or the macro level. But externalities are a very important, outflow of economic activity, and they have to be dealt with. So, thank you very much. I appreciate your time.
Thank you. Can I respond to? Am I allowed to?
Make sure. I think we have a number of people that want to speak.
Okay.
But yes, you can.
I just want to say that in terms of the time at the elementary and middle school, we do know that is an issue, and one of the reasons we created the standards the way they were was for that interdisciplinary connection, and we'll be creating workshops, professional development, and guidance documents to help those teachers meet their time while also building literacy, mathematics, and everything else. Thank you so much. Okay, Mr. Benali?
My name's Timothy Benali. I'm the Assistant Superintendent for the Department of Education, Navajo Nation. And I think my focus is coming from the perspective of assimilation and acculturation. So as of right now, to the extent of acculturation for the Navajo people, which is almost 1/4 of the state of Arizona, and we have about 7-8 school districts, and all the schools within the Navajo Nation who are bureau schools and grant schools for high school, they all go into the public schools. So from that standpoint, from acculturation, and then everybody, all the students, almost all of them graduating from a public school. We bring up, as far as religion is concerned, Christianity, Judaism, and Confucius. All we do those religions, but here around the state, right here, we don't. We have religion. We do, but to what extent it's mentioned or it's not mentioned. I think as far as high school is concerned, because my understanding is they're gonna be choosing the standards and how they're gonna choose the resources for that. I think that's a great idea, and that's a good things could happen for our students to know that this is who they are. And then the other one is I think there has to be a contrast. Similarities, differences in why there was the Europeans move to the new land, what was going on over there. So the similarities and the difference, and then when around 1800, as far as Andrew Jackson moving all the Indian people this way, across the Mississippi and this way, and putting them in on reservations. So I guess the other point is that there was a surviving, the definition of civilization, the definition of you're now civilized, So there was a surviving, striving Indian people before 1492. I think that's a point need to be made, and the comparison similarities between me, I want to share that. Those are the two things that I wanted to share.
Thank you. And we, our public feedback reflected a lot of the old standards not having Native history in them. And it was good to hear you talk about those things, because I know the committee, especially if you look at fourth grade, really does look at life in America prior to European exploration. And Teresa and I have been working with Dr. Ridingen from ASU with their American Indian Studies program, and the Steele Phoenix Indian School Visitors Center, in coming up with some professional development for teachers to teach American Indian history. And we've been using from the Heard Museum, we've been using that idea of through the idea of strength and resiliency. So we're making strides in that area, but all of your feedback, and if you could get other members of your communities to give us the feedback, because we are very interested to make sure that these standards are for all Arizona students, no matter what their religion, race, national origin, where they're from. These are their standards. They should be reflected within them. Okay. I swear. Ms. Gunner, did you want to, yeah. Did I pronounced it wrong, didn't I? Goomer.
Sorry, I just wanted to make sure there was another
it's okay. It looks like two ends to me.
Yeah, my handwriting's not the best.
My handwriting is awful. So.
Hi, my name is Angeline Goomer, and I am a parent and also an advocate for the Sikh religion. So I really just want to say thank you for the inclusion of Sikhism as one of the world religions for sixth graders and high schoolers to study. So Sikhism is the fifth largest religion in the world. And while it is one of the larger religions, oftentimes people don't know about it. I think the stat that I remember most is 60% of Americans don't know what a Sikh is or don't know who a Sikh is. And because of the turban that Sikhs wear, there's oftentimes a lot of discrimination, and especially in high school, bullying. So I have two little boys. Brought my little kindergartner here with me, which is the reason why this was so important to me. 2 out of 3 Sikh turban kids will get bullied in school in America, and that's a big stat. But I think if we do some of this education and show our youth that, you know, there are people that are different and that look different, it'll prevent some of this bullying and get them ready for the diverse real world that's out there. So just wanted to say thank you for including that.
And thank you for the public feedback. And this is an example where public feedback, we really do listen to the feedback, and we encourage you to give specific, actionable feedback to us. William left, and he just had a question about, is the Civil War still in 7th grade, and do 8th graders still do the American Revolution? And we talked about that during the break. Oh, I'm sorry. So the 7th grade has shifted to global from 1500 to the present, focusing more on world turning points and the role of the U.S. in those turning points. So the Civil War would not necessarily be taught in 7th grade anymore. There are many, as in 8th grade, as educators are looking at the issue of civil rights movements and the African American civil rights movement. Many teachers will go back and rebuild foundation by looking at Civil War and Reconstruction. But then again, that depends on their students and what their knowledge level is when they go in. And then American Revolution. American Revolution, the 8th grade does focus on that foundations of the Constitution, so it could be taught there. Or I was telling William that there is a revolutions standard for the 7th grade where they compare revolutions. So a teacher could compare the American Revolution to the French Revolution, to Latin American revolutions, that type of thing. Again, that's that flexibility for local control. And then, Corrine, did you want to read yours? Oh, you have. Yeah,
I have. Yeah,
okay.
Here. Okay, my name is Corrine Haynes, and I am a retired teacher, taught in the Deer Valley School District for many years, now Tammy. Language arts, 7th grade, and then art K-8 art for many years, and worked on many national standard curriculum projects and wrote lots of curriculum at Deer Valley. So I appreciate and understand all the work that went into this document, because I know how much we argued over every dotted I and crossed T when we wrote them. But I am here basically feedback from my 89-year-old mother, who said, "What happened to history? We're not teaching history to our kids anymore." And of course, she remembered being taught history, and then remembered when it went to social studies. And I get feedback from my own children, who are now grown, and grandchildren, feedback from all kinds of people in the neighborhood, and it always comes back, the kids are not learning history. And I do worry about that. And I see the input and see what you have tried to do in the new standards, and I appreciate that. But also, being a teacher, I know what happens to these standards and curriculums where they sit on a teacher's bookshelf and never gets looked at. I know there are limitations to time. So my concern still is, are they going to learn our American history? So I sat down yesterday and I kind of wrote this up. If I were writing the standards, I would take our history standards out and have them stand alone. I mean, you're still going to teach civics and geography. I've looked at some of other curriculums, other schools that not here in our state, but how do they approach teaching it? And so I would love to see history be a standalone. I want our kids to know our American history. And so should I read this? Take the time to read it? Okay. I start out because I had this always hanging in my classroom when I taught art, and we would discuss it, and I said, the preservation of liberty depends upon the intellectual and moral character of the people. And it was a John Adams quote that I read when I was reading about John Adams, and I thought, that says it all, because without the education and the moral character, we do not have liberty. And so I put, in order to preserve our republic, students must know our national story and understand that Americans are united by our creed of freedom and equality. The United States history standards, I agree, are what a student needs to know, understand, and be able to do at the end of each grade. I feel the United States history standards should be a chronological progression of American history from its beginning to present day. I would view it in grades K through 2. History standards focus on the role of famous individuals in shaping the United States. Students should learn the historical significance of America's founders, statesmen, presidents, pioneers, military and religious leaders, inventors, scientists, philanthropists, volunteers, and industrialists. Through biographies, autobiographies, and source documents, students can study American history by investigating the important contributions of the founders and the men and women who followed them. And so I kind of rearranging what you have is good, but I would rearrange it. And in grades 3 through 6, the history standards provide, and I would say, a thorough chronological coverage of American history. So it is in depth. It's not just touching a little here and a little there. From the earliest times, identify the major themes in American history and convey a sense of the breadth of experiences and influences that have shaped the United States of America. Also in grade 6, you should include the history and development of the state of Arizona. In grade 7, the focus will shift from American history to ancient civilizations, but I think also looking at how those civilizations and the knowledge that we know of those, how they impacted our own history. The content would be viewed through geographic and historical lenses. 7th graders would understand the cultural, religious, economic, and or political systems of selected civilizations, because you have to select them. There's too many. Choose the ones that would impact what you are teaching. The content would provide the foundational knowledge students need to continue their history education at the secondary level. In grade 8, history standards would focus on in-depth knowledge and understanding of the Declaration's independence, our Constitution, Bill of Rights, and civic knowledge and understanding to be a positive contributor to maintaining a republic, which I think is kind of what's in the standards that you have created now. Students will understand the free enterprise system, entrepreneurship, ownership, and the difference between capitalism and socialism. Students will recognize and be able to support why America is an exceptional nation. And I also feel that there should be an 8th grade assessment given on the U.S. Constitution, which I had when I was in 8th grade here in Arizona in order to graduate. I just strongly feel that what has been developed and what you've done is excellent, but I know as a teacher, former teacher, retired teacher, and everything that falls upon the teachers to teach, I just think that where's history? Where are we learning about our nation? Because until we have an in-depth and thorough knowledge of our own history, how can we even compare it and do all of the wonderful up through to the evaluation, skills that you've set out there. And my comment was, good luck finding teachers to implement these standards, because what we have right now, it's even with your training and input, I don't know if this is going to be done. And to me, it's essential we have to start teaching our kids our own national story.
Okay.
That's my input.
Thank you. Yeah.
You want both or just, okay, yeah.
Yep. Okay. So do we have any other questions, comments? Yes. Have a seat.
It's a hot seat.
My name is Ed Wrights, and I bring a perspective of many years. I graduated from grade school in 1939. I graduated from high school in 1943. Things are quite different since 1939. You have done a very thorough job on the draft, and I read all 53 pages. And what I'm concerned about, my experience in education is 4 years as a therapist at Trinity High School, just outside of Palm Springs. That was a resident high school where they were all on probation, and 80% of them were gangbangers. So that was quite an experience. But that's my only experience in a school was 4 years. I am a pastor. I'm a graduate of Princeton Theological Seminary, and have founded churches and written a couple of books and done many, many things. But what I was concerned about with the draft is not what's in it, but what's not in it. The word God isn't there one time. The word Christianity, religious movements and effects on the nation, all these different kinds of things they're very good, very inclusive. But how many of the students are going to know what the motto of the United States of America is? Our president has mentioned it several times in recent speeches. You ask the average person, they have no idea what the motto of the United States is. In God we trust. It became the motto during the administration of Dwight D. Eisenhower. It's also during the time when we added under God in our pledge. And I'm just concerned about how we're teaching the motivation of the Pilgrims coming over here, their Christian motivation and why they left, the attitude of the Founding Fathers, and the words from the beginning of our Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and being endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Are the students getting any sense of the fact that this is a Christian nation. Doesn't mean that we aren't free in religion. We are. Anyone can come here and exercise their religion freely. But according to the Congress of the United States in, I think it was 1892, they declared that America was a Christian nation. Were they right? Well, our foundings were that, and every coin we have in our pocket says, "In God we trust." What God? It's the Judeo-Christian God. That's who it is. And I'd like to see the students, I'm not asking you to teach religion, but I'm asking you to bring God into the picture and the understanding of where America came from and where it should be going.
Thank you.
Mr. Rex. Mr. Rex. May I keep it?
Oh, it's nothing much.
Well, it'll help us keep records so we have a record of everything that was said. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions? Yes.
I don't
Comments?
have a question. I just want to ditto everything he said.
Okay.
That was beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Go to your next steps.
Okay. So what's the next step? So the next step is that we are going to collect your comments and questions from today's meeting, and we'll add them to the public feedback analysis. We also have a survey to collect public comments on the draft. It's open till May 28th. And what will happen is we will respond. We will take all of the public feedback into the working groups. And we ask that it be actionable feedback. We can only work from specific feedback that talks about standards. We, due to legislation, cannot change curriculum or instruction. We also will have this public meeting available on the YouTube channel with the State Board, and it will be up there, I guess, for perpetuity. No, I don't know how long. And if you want to share it with members of the community, educators at your school, other parents. We will begin reconvening the working groups. We will be reconvening working groups starting May 30th. We are still accepting applications for educators to be on the working groups. We will present revised standards to the State Board for adoption, and our hope is that we can do that by the end of the summer. So we'll be calling several working groups back through the month of June and July. Yes?
Yeah, go ahead.
Just a quick question. Is it possible, or is it by law you can't? Can you have just history standards and then social science standards? Is there any way they can be separate standards, or do they have to be combined?
I don't think there's any legislation that says they have to be combined. By creating history and social science standards, we attempted to delineate stronger content in history and then stronger content in the social sciences, moving away from the idea of the social studies.
So I just wanted to take a moment and say thank you so much for the time that you spent with us today. We really do appreciate your feedback, appreciate your insights. If you think of something that you just, gosh darn, you forgot to say it today, please do go on to that website. It is there for you to provide comment. You can skip around and provide comment only on those items that you want to provide comment on, so you don't have to go through all, was it 73 pages?
Yeah.
73 pages, and comment on everything. But if there's really something that you think about later that you wanted to make sure, but do know that that's why I collected your papers today, so that we have all of the feedback that you gave today. And again, you do not know how much we appreciate you spending your time here with us today, providing your insights, your feedback. It is extremely helpful and extremely necessary. I was
I don't know. I go on Facebook sometimes. I probably shouldn't. But anyway, there was this thing on there about Maya Angelou, and it had a quote on there from her that I just thought was so relevant to the standards process. And it was talking about, everybody looks at the butterfly and thinks, how beautiful is that butterfly? But they forget about all the stages that the butterfly had to go through to become a butterfly. And so this is part of those stages of becoming a butterfly. So what we know is we have a draft, and we have a great place to start, and we appreciate you helping us get through the stages of becoming a beautiful butterfly, because that's where we're going to be, I think, when we get there, and due in large part to your feedback and your insights. So again, thank you very much. Some of you drove from so far away. Thank you so very much. We really appreciate it, and have a safe trip back to wherever you call home. Thank you.
Thank you.